Many thanks for joining us today to participate in the second session of the Drive Research Forum's series of panel discussions for considering the case of gene drive technologies through social science theories on stakeholder engagement. We again have global participation with a couple members of the panel joining us at a time when I'm sure they would rather be sleeping, so thank you very much. I'm Royden Saw from Island Conservation. I represent the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Partnership, also known as GBIRD. In addition to GBIRD, the Gene Drive Research Forum series is co-hosted by the Gene Convene Global Collaborative. Today's session, titled Stakeholder Engagement and Risk Assessment, What are the Lessons for Gene Drive Research Engagement, is the second in the lineup of 5 in this series. My colleague Karen Tutas from the Foundation of the National Institutes of Health and I were very pleased that Dr. Sujatha Raman, Associate Professor at Australia National University, accepted our invitation to moderate this panel's discussion, which should prove to be very intriguing. Thank you very much, Sujatha. And now I will turn the virtual floor and this session over to you to introduce the panelists and begin the dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Royden and Karen, for all the organizational work that went into putting together this panel, but also the whole series, and your colleagues at FNIH as well. I'm really pleased to be moderating it. We've got a terrific lineup of panelists for today. So I'm going to just do a round of quick introductions before we get into the topic for today. So first up, we have Sarah Hartley, who is at the University of Exeter in the UK. Sarah is a social scientist, and she's leading a number of research projects on stakeholder engagement and the governance of gene drive. We have Keith Hayes, who is a senior scientist at Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO. And Keith is leading a number of projects on ecological and environmental risk assessment. We have Adam Kokotovich from North Carolina State University in the US. Adam is an interdisciplinary social scientist and is involved in numerous projects on enhancing risk assessment by using stakeholder engagement. And last but not least, we've got Sam Weiss-Evans from Harvard University. And Sam is also a social scientist interested in ways of creating better feedback loops between gene drive researchers and the communities that they engage with. So before I turn the floor over to our panelists, I just want to say a few words about why we're here today. And particularly just reflect briefly on the question of why we're even talking about stakeholder engagement and risk assessment in the same breath. So as you know, the whole series of panels is on stakeholder engagement more generally, but this is the one panel that's particularly looking at the interface between risk assessment. And for a moment, that might seem a kind of an odd conjunction. It may be that most people might assume that risk assessment is something that's done by scientists, and then you've got stakeholder engagement with people who are non-scientists, and it's work that you do after the job of risk assessment is completed. But just it's worth keeping in mind that this kind of attempt to bring the two dimensions together is not entirely new. We've been here before in some fashion, certainly in the history, in the American history of environmental risk assessment. And hopefully some of the previous experiences will inform our discussions today. So I just want to briefly spotlight a couple of key developments. So people who have been in this field for a long time will certainly know the name of Alvin Weinberg, who coined the name trans science in 1972 to describe the work of risk assessment as something that sits between science and policy. It's not, can't be described entirely as a scientific activity in his terms. Fast forward a decade, you've got the famous Red Book, the National Research Council's Red Book on risk assessment guidelines. And here there's a kind of sense that risk assessment is very clearly separated from risk management. Risk assessment is about science and risk management is supposed to be about values. And today we might say this process of handling values might maybe involve some sort of engagement with stakeholders. But then again, fast forward another decade or so, and you see that scientists by now are starting to sort of reflect maybe even more strongly on the fact that it's often difficult to draw a very clear boundary between the activities of assessment and the activities of management, risk management. And so you've got the National Research Council 1994 report on science and judgment, which reflects on the fact that the scientific data, scientific risk assessments can be interpreted, can be done differently. So we need some kind of process of negotiating differences in scientific and expert judgment, and perhaps even in policy judgment. And again, today we might say that's the space of stakeholder engagement. So this is just by way of highlighting that there is a history to some of the discussions we're going to be having today. It's also worth pointing out that there is a considerable body of social science work on risk assessment, looking at these debates, thinking about how we understand the scope of risk assessment and its relationship to everything else. Many of all the panelists today have contributed to that body of work. So with that history in mind, I want to just pose an opening question for our panelists today. And that is basically looking back at the 2016 National Academy's report on gene drive on the horizon. I want to invite our panelists to reflect a bit on the definition of risk assessment that's offered in that report. So this is a definition that describes risk assessment as quantitative, as probabilistic. If I can invite you to think about what does this mean? What does this definition of risk assessment mean for our job today, for the activity of connecting risk assessment and stakeholder engagement? Is the definition adequate? What are its implications for thinking about risk assessment and stakeholder engagement? So if I can invite Keith to go first to reflect on that question. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Sujatha. So yeah, I'm a strong advocate of the sort of probabilistic approach to risk assessment and always have been and critical of sort of the alternative approaches. And there are many alternative approaches, broadly categorized as qualitative or semi-quantitative. So, whilst I've been an advocate of quantitative approaches, I'm also a strong advocate for stakeholder sort of participation in the process. And one of the things I've always sort of, I guess I think about is, to what extent does the quantitative approach present barriers to, to stakeholder engagement, and how do we, remove those barriers, or how do we make that process a bit easier? And I think so. This is, the panel discussion is an excellent opportunity because, I think we can reflect on the different areas that stakeholders participate in risk assessment. And I think there are some parts of their participation, it doesn't matter whether it's a quantitative approach or a qualitative approach. I think there's some sort of commonalities there. And I think, if we can flesh those out, that'd be really useful. And so, for example, in the expression of what we care about, in the expression of, how we think the world works, and those, the way the world works, those conceptual models underlie all our risk perceptions, our own risk judgments. So, I think there's the early stages of the risk assessment, what we care about, why that's, how we express that, levels of harm, maybe risk acceptance criteria. Those things are, to some extent, can be immune to whether it's a quantitative or qualitative approach. But then the next steps, actually the risk calculations, to what extent we expect to see stakeholder engagement in that, because if you're moving from qualitative to a probabilistic quantitative approach, obviously that becomes much harder for stakeholders, or the level of expertise required for them to participate in that process becomes much higher. So that's a more difficult step for them. But I think in the final sort of areas of risk, the final area which I view as important in risk assessment is a sort of the invalidation of the risk predictions. Again, what role does stakeholder engagement can play in that? What role can stakeholders play in, in invalidating the predictions, sort of, citizen science, for example, and monitoring and looking for outcomes. Maybe again, maybe that's not so immune. I think actually in the probabilistic approach, that might even be easier because it's more amenable to the scientific method. So yeah, I think there's, I think part of we should try and identify where we think that it doesn't matter so much, and perhaps where it becomes more of a barrier. Sujatha, would be my thoughts.
Thank you. So the stages of risk assessment, very useful. Thank you. Sarah, can I invite you to go next?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the first thing I just want to say is that stakeholder engagement or public engagement of any kind in risk assessment is really challenging. And I don't know of any cases outside of Gene Drive where we've really managed this successfully. So let's just put that as a starting point. I think there's some things about Gene Drive which will make stakeholder engagement even more challenging. One of those, I think, is the increased reliance on modeling in risk assessment for Gene Drive. And I think this is a shift. We're seeing a shift in the way that modeling or its role in risk assessment. And that is, I think, going to be more challenging for opening up those spaces to publics and stakeholders than we have perhaps done in other areas. But just coming back to your point about the NASM report. So if we think about, and that's a great context, Sujatha, that you set out a kind of history of thinking about this tension between whether we want to call it science and democracy or facts and values or experts and lay, but there's this tension going on throughout. And we see that really clearly in the NASM document because we have, it's been lauded for its attentiveness to engagement, and it's been a kind of milestone, I think, in the Gene Drive discussion around engagement. And yet in its discussion of risk assessment, there's no mention of engagement. And so we still see that very clear separation between engagement and risk assessment in NASM. And I think we need to move past that. We need to find a way to perhaps disentangle risk assessment to find where engagement can take place, what kind of engagement needs to take place. It may be stakeholders at some points, it may be interdisciplinary expertise in other areas. But there are some steps we can do to try and bring these areas together in Gene Drive. And I think this is what's interesting for me about Gene Drive, having worked in this space for a long time, is that there's real momentum to try and start thinking about how we do engagement in risk assessment.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Adam?
Yes, thank you. Just building upon what's been said already, I kind of like to think about it not in terms of what's the role of, well, within risk assessment, what's the role of engagement, but within engagement, what's the role of risk assessment almost. So kind of putting the definition on its head and starting first with the definition of engagement in the NASM report, which is defined as seeking and facilitating the sharing and exchange of knowledge, perspectives, and preferences between or among groups who often have differences in expertise, power, and values. And so to think about what's the implication of that for risk assessment? And for me, engaging people in that way, looking at differences in expertise, looking at differences in perspectives, in values, is important because of the value judgments present within risk assessment. So you can use engagement to help recognize or identify where those value judgments are, reflect upon what's at stake in the different ways that we can make those value judgments, and then ultimately inform what form those take. And as Keith was talking about, there's different components or steps of risk assessment where that's going to take a different form and involve different types of different amounts of expertise to engage. So in problem formulation, some of the types of questions that you engage with, you don't need a lot of expertise, subject matter expertise, whereas to take part in engagement within the analysis phase of risk assessment takes a different amount of expertise. So as a starting point for me, just thinking about what is engagement, why is it useful, and what's the role for it to have when taking part in this risk assessment process that's really at the intersection of science and values. That's generally how I think of the starting place.
Thank you. We'll definitely come back to that that question of the kind of how do we think about the purpose of stakeholder engagement and the role of risk assessment in that context. Sam, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This is wonderful to have this opportunity to talk with everyone. And Sujatha, I think your painting of the history of the risk assessment discussion through these National Academy reports, in a way, it shows, one way to think of it is showing the disconnect, and weirdly, between those Academy reports and the kind of lived experience of a lot of the risk assessment community over the last 40, 50 years. And I think that disconnect is shown very clearly in the NASM report, because as Sarah pointed out, there is this very strong disconnect between the chapter on risk assessment and the other chapters on charting human values and engagement and the like. And this is after that chapter on risk assessment was revised several times, in the process of the committee work to try and make it connect more with those other chapters. And the difficulty of even after those revisions of having the connection be clear and coherent, I think shows the kind of uphill challenges, again, to use a term from Sarah, that we need to work with. And so I want to take a second to talk about, well, what's partly at the root of some of those challenges. And I think the drive for quantification is a drive for certainty in what is a very uncertain process of doing risk analysis and management. And the quantification is an effort to try and present an authority of speaking for the world, of speaking for what is really out there. And I think necessarily and always that's going to come into contention with people who think that they have a different view, a different frame of the types of issues that need to be considered and what needs to be done in relation to them. And so this tension between assessment and or risk assessment management and stakeholder engagement, I think really stems from a belief in a separation of, well, one way to talk about it might be to pull up the Science Policy Forum piece that Greg Kapnick and several others on the committee, on the NASM committee, published shortly after the report came out, where they were talking about how there's often this misconception of risk assessment being a source of reason and stakeholder engagement or precautionary work of the like being a source of emotion, and believing that this is possible to separate. And that goes back, very long in the development of science as a discipline. And I think that we're working towards getting past that assumption of the separation of facts and values, of emotion and reason. And these reports that you highlight in the beginning are efforts to move in that direction. But I think we need to remember that at every turn, we are encountering opposing forces that are trying to say, that something like a risk assessment is a way of getting at the world. The last point I'll say very quickly here is pulling on something else Sarah mentioned about modeling, the increased reliance on modeling in this space. I don't think that necessarily needs to be a source of concern. It can also be a source of actually engaging with communities more, as models can be used to show possible worlds. So multiple ways of demonstrating what could happen in the development of gene drives as a way of opening up conversation and opening up community engagement opportunities. So we can talk about that more perhaps later in the conversation.
Thank you. Fantastic Sam. That was really useful. So I wonder if I can just pick up on a theme that all of you touched upon in different ways. So I think one point is, and Keith, you made this very early on, one point is that there could be, one way to think about risk assessment is that there are these different stages involved in it. And it may be that stakeholder engagement is appropriate or more appropriate at certain stages of that process. So it may be that we want to reflect a bit more on that kind of stage-based understanding of risk assessment, which might then give us some guidance for thinking about the role of engagement. Adam, you turn that around to some extent by saying, well, actually, let's start with engagement as the big question, and then think about where risk assessment fits into that. And I thought that's very interesting, but I wonder if by framing it that way, are you sort of assuming that you've got a broader, more qualitative process that stakeholder engagement can facilitate, and then within that you've got a quantitative analysis that risk assessment will do, and can maybe perhaps be left to scientists. So in other words, what are the implications of thinking about the relationship between engagement and assessment in the way that you did? And then just finally, another aspect of that is, Sarah, you I think were suggesting that what's going on here is something that's a bit more than quantification per se, but it's a particular type of quantification entailed by modeling. And you and Sam had, I think, slightly different takes on what the rise or the shift to modeling does for thinking about engagement. So I wonder if we can just spend a little bit more time on those questions. So in other words, thinking of risk assessment in terms of these stages, and maybe some stages are more amenable, if you like, to engagement than others. And the other part of that, which is thinking about particular methods in risk assessment, which rely more on modeling, and what that then means for what that then means for engagement. So who would like to run with that?
I'll have a start if you like, Sujatha. I mean,
go ahead, please. Thank you.
Yeah. I think let's just take one example to try and make some issues more concrete, because there are many issues wrapped up in there. There's a really very early on in a risk assessment, I think, an essential component, and Adam gave a very good talk about this as well previously. That an essential component you really do want stakeholder participation in the process is what do we care about? So what is it? What values are we taking through the risk assessment? What are we defining? What impact? What do we care about? Why are we doing the process? I mean, and that should reflect the stakeholders' concerns. It should reflect the concerns and the values of people who bear the risks from a particular activity. So I think that's an essential step. I think of all the places where stakeholders need to be engaged, I think that's one of the relatively more easier places for them to be engaged. And that I think it doesn't matter whether it's probabilistic or qualitative. You say to people, what do you care about? What is it you value? I think that's it's not a science question. That should precede every risk assessment. One of the next things I want to just bring with that, though, is one of the next question there is, well, how much impact on that are you willing to accept, right? For a nominal benefit or perceived benefit, or the benefit that this proposed technology is trying to solve, or is trying to provide. Now that again is a bit harder, and actually that's actually impossible to do qualitatively. So this is where one of the issues becomes really important, because if I say to somebody, you say we want to protect a particular asset, we want to protect a particular environmental value that they've expressed, and they say, well, I say, how much harm are you willing to accept on that for a given level of benefit? And they say, well, just a little bit. I can't go to the environment and just measure just a little bit. I don't know what just a little bit means. If they say, oh, well, I'd accept quite a bit of that because, I think the benefit is enormous. Again, those terms, until those terms are quantified and until the predictions of the risk assessment are lined up with those quantitative definitions, I can't say whether, A, whether the predictions are any good, and B, whether they actually meet the risk acceptance criteria that the community has expressed. So I think that's an example where where right at the very beginning of the assessment, we should try and get an understanding of what people care about and how much harm they're willing to, on that they're willing to accept. But then how you approach that from the risk assessment becomes quite divergent depending on whether you use a qualitative or quantitative approach. So it's just, that's a kind of a nice example, I think, and it occurs very early in the risk assessment, or should occur very early in the risk assessment, to my mind.
Thank you. That sets up, I think, Sarah, I can see you want to respond. Yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful, Keith, to tear that apart a little bit. And I'd like to kind of just zoom out a little bit and put risk assessment in the kind of broader governance context. Because what we're seeing, I think, in Gene Drive at the moment is the development of what Eric Millstone has called these risk assessment policies. And this is the risk assessment framework. So we haven't had, there's been no Gene Drive that's gone through a risk assessment at the moment in terms of its regulatory approval process for release into the environment. So at the moment, all the efforts are placed on developing the framework, which is outlined in what's called guidelines or risk assessment policies. This is what Codex calls it. And most countries in the world have signed up to a commitment to explicitly developing risk assessment policies and a commitment to conduct engagement in the development of risk assessment policies. So we already have a kind of mechanism for engagement when we set up the risk assessment process. Once products start going through that process, that's a different kind of set of questions, and a different kind of engagement will be needed at that point than there is in the setting up of the framework to start with. And we know, so for example, in Gene Drive, there's been a number of kind of informal or incremental meetings, workshops, documents that have been taking place over the last few years, which have started to map out this framework for risk assessment. And most of that work's happening in the US and the UK. Some of it in Australia, but still dominated by UK and US participants. And very, very little engagement by African participants, even though we think that the first field trial will take place in Africa. And so there's sort of even before we get thinking about actual publics or stakeholders in a risk assessment, in the broader governance context, it's very likely that the risk assessment framework will get pinned down in this process before there's been any kind of discussion about engagement. It already is happening. Since 2014, it started happening, but it's been accelerating quite more rapidly over the last couple of years. And I think that's the first point I want to make, is that situating it in the governance context. The second point, I think, is that if we start to engage, we need to start thinking about how we respond to that engagement. And I think that's going to be a challenge, right? There's all, we've experienced that in engagement in other contexts outside of risk assessment. It's all very well to have an engagement activity, but actually to respond to it is perhaps even more challenging. And I think that's something we also need to think about here as we move closer. And we see that, for example, the European Food Safety Authority had a stakeholder workshop for Gene Drive risk assessment in its decision about whether existing regulatory frameworks were sufficient for Gene Drive. And right at the start of the process, it held a stakeholder workshop. But it was very difficult to respond because EFSA's remit is a science-based remit, and it's not really able to respond to these other kinds of inputs that stakeholders are raising, issues that they're raising. And so there's a challenge there too. And we also need to think about how we then, do we need to expand the remit of these organizations, risk assessors, but institutionally, in the context of governance, we need to rethink about what stakeholder engagement means and what changes are needed.
Thank you, Sarah. So we'll towards the end, I want to have us think about what are the kind of future implications, where are the areas that need improvement, and I can see you've already highlighted something there, and perhaps we can come back to it. Adam, did you want to jump in on, from your experience doing this work?
Well, just to comment on why might it be useful to think about engagement as the overarching umbrella. And for me, it's this kind of guiding question of where does your perspective, values, and expertise matter, right? So, or you could think just as an umbrella term, where does worldview matter in terms of how we make these decisions? And, the engagement chapter in NASM, just to go back to that, emphasizes that, whether and under what conditions you think these technologies should be used is dependent upon your worldview. So dependent upon your lived experience, your values, how you relate to nature, how you relate to technology. And therefore, we should use engagement to be aware of the diversity of perspectives that exist to make better decisions. In the risk assessment realm, perspective, values, and expertise also matters, just in different ways, right? And so if we think about, as we go through a risk assessment, where are the places where your worldview will lead you to make decisions differently is kind of a helpful guiding question. So of course, as Keith was laying out quite clearly, what do we care about? What do we want to make sure that's not going to be negatively impacted? That's certainly based on our worldview. Where the line between inconsequential change, where that line between inconsequential change and significant harm lies, that's certainly based on one's worldview. And those, are within the problem formulation phase. You don't need a lot of expertise about risk assessment or technology to be thinking about those questions. However, we also know from a long line of scholarship that our worldviews matter in other components of risk assessment and in other components of how we design and conduct scientific studies, right? So how do you design scientific studies? How do you deal with uncertainty? How do you make extrapolations? All of those things also have a component of values or worldview within them. And therefore, if we care about making better decisions, making more just decisions, making more trusted decisions, we will, it makes sense to bring engagement to these different components. It'll take a different form, but it makes sense to be doing so. So for me, that's why, thinking about that overarching question and then what form it takes in the different components of risk assessment makes sense.
Thank you. So just building on that then, is it appropriate to think, can we go back to the question then of that Keith laid out, where I think, Keith, you said some of this work, so for example, doing a risk-benefit calculation, risk-benefit analysis, that by definition needs to involve some kind of quantification. That doing that analysis in a qualitative way doesn't give you enough useful information or inputs that you can then use in a risk management or governance process. And Sam, given that you talked at the start about quantification, did you want to maybe pick up on that point, this notion that some of this is going to ultimately have to be in a quantitative form?
I think, Keith, you want to go first? No?
Yeah, Sam, do you want to respond, and then we'll give Keith the chance to come back.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree that the quantification part and move is an important part of the whole process, and does serve an important and valuable role. The questions that I've got though is at the beginning you talked about how I'm interested in these feedback loop mechanisms, and so there's a I think as all of us have been pointing out, and Sarah and Adam in particular, that there are ways of interlocking at each stage of the risk assessment framework that Keith talked about at the beginning, for opening up each of those moments of decision to an appreciation of how those decisions could be made differently. What types of locales you might be focusing on, what types of what constitutes a detriment or a harm, and what constitutes a benefit. What kinds of, if you're doing ecological risk assessment, and what aspects of the environment are you also attending to? Which ones do you think you don't need to attend to? What constitutes acceptable levels of those? These very quickly do become quantitative discussions. But to Keith's point, that the more they become quantitative, the more that you kind of raise the barrier of the level of expertise that's needed to engage with those conversations. I think that's a very rich location for us to be experimenting, and how we have these feedback loops between the engagement efforts that we have and the risk assessment processes we have. And so, if gene drives are to be this really experimental place where we can, where we're trying to push the bounds in some ways of going back to 1994 on the importance of integrating qualitative and quantitative aspects of trying to make decisions on what types of research we should have and what should go forward, then that speaks to us looking for a lot more research and experiments on how to have this kind of feedback loop in these specific projects that are going forward or thought of going forward on the gene drive space. Positive.
So in a sense, the fact that there is maybe a need for quantification doesn't rule out, or maybe even kind of enhances the scope of doing some engagement work around different elements of this in a more kind of open experimental fashion.
Sujatha, if I could just, sorry. Oh no, I just wanted to say one point is that the one of the real values of quantification is the specificity of it, right? So I think one of the problems with a lot of stakeholder engagement in general is being quite general in the conversations that are being had. That when things get quantified, things become very specific, and that specificity is an ability to create a specific site for working through competing framings of what do we care about, what's important in these cases, who should have a say, and what constitutes justice and fairness as much as a harm to the environment or the like. So the specificity of quantification allows for those debates to get a real grasp on a specific case to move the conversation forward.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So Keith, I'm going to ask you to respond to that in just a moment, but just to kind of prefigure what's coming next, I think I want to get people thinking about exploring some examples of engagement processes that have already been taken place around gene drive and the extent to which those have informed or not informed risk assessment. Sort of building here on some of the questions that are coming from the flow. But before we do that, before we move on to talking about reflecting on experiences of engagement at the interface with risk assessment on gene drive, Keith, did you want to respond just to that point, that quantification in a sense can, precisely because it's so specific in the ways that you described, it can actually allow and necessitate this sort of broader engagement. That's the point that Sam just made.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with what Sam's saying there. It's probably I think it's probably worth if you have an opportunity with the time left for us to reflect also on there are some significant barriers to stakeholder engagement, and to pick up on Sarah's point, gene drives in Africa, an example which I think which resonates with me. I think there's a talk that some of the stakeholder engagement coming from the stakeholder engagement activities that were occurring in Africa at the time around gene drive was one of the issues that was made was that there's in some of the local dialects there's no word for gene drive. Like it's not you can't take that and translate it into their dialect. Like there isn't a word for it. So even that, I mean, maybe it's something perhaps we take it too much for granted, but even there are, even at that very basic level, trying to explain to somebody, what the proposal is, why it's been done, what the pros and cons of it may be, what the potential benefits may be. In this context in Africa, there could be, some issues there associated even with that, that basic communication, which we perhaps take for granted. So I think that those sort of specific issues of gene drive in Africa, but the more general issue of the barriers to engagement, I think it's something definitely worth thinking about. I mean, I agree with Sam. I think the specificity of the quantification prevents a miscommunication whereby Joe says something and Fred says something else, and they both think they're agreeing with each other, but actually they're thinking about something totally different. And linguistic uncertainty is what's is so large that what you think is an alignment is not an alignment, and then further down the track that misalignment becomes apparent and becomes a problem. So I think the quantification helps remove that part of the issue, but I think there are still, I still wonder why, after 40, 50 years of talking about stakeholder engagement and risk assessment, we don't routinely see it. I do a lot of risk assessments, that's my job, and we do not routinely see stakeholders engaged in this process. And I still wonder why, why that is the case, because I still think it's extremely valuable. So maybe perhaps some of the reflection on some of those barriers, and and gene drives in Africa seem to raise the bar on some of those barriers in particular. So I think that's something worth reflecting upon.
Thank you. So the barriers for stakeholder engagement, let's come back to that in a moment. But I think the point there links very nicely to a question from the floor as well. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you to kind of respond to this. So you said earlier on that some of this work is happening at the governance level to kind of pin down frameworks for risk assessment. And I think your point there was that this was being done without much engagement with stakeholders in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. So the question from the floor is, what about the numerous workshops? And I think Keith, you've mentioned those as well. NEPAD workshops in Africa, the work of the West African Vector Integrated Management Group working on risk assessment. So can you maybe reflect a bit on some of the activities that have taken place around engagement and how that reflects on the sort of pinning down of a framework for risk assessment?
Yeah. Yes, thanks. Thanks, Delphine, for that. So the workshops, which I think Delphine is referring to, are a set of 4 workshops held by NEPAD across, I think, around 2016, 17, 18, something like that. And they were reported in 2019 in an article. And the findings were that a lot of so these were stakeholder workshops, and the findings were that the kind of issues that stakeholders are raising were very similar to those of some of the scientists, stakeholders who'd been involved in the US workshops, identifying some of the risks around gene drive. And so in my mind, those workshops are a further evidence for how we can do and why we should be doing stakeholder engagement. We're perfectly able to do that. Stakeholders are perfectly able to engage on issues of risk assessment. So there are those workshops, and there's a set of, as Delphine said, there's another set of activities going on, but they're still overwhelmed by events that are happening in the US and the UK. I don't think there's any question in my mind that the dominant framing of the risk assessment guidelines, which are kind of emerging in this ad hoc incremental way, are not being driven by African governance, whether it's by African scientists or whether it's by regulators in Africa. So I still think there's a gap there that still needs to be filled, even though there's some very good work that is going on there. And that's certainly been accelerating, I would say, since 2019. So there's more and more going on, including our own work in Uganda with stakeholders around the risks and benefits. Can I just also pick up on Delphine's other point about the stakeholders, as I see that question coming up there about, and this is another point which I wanted to raise earlier, is we're talking just about stakeholders in quite a nebulous way. And I think, Claire Maris has made this point in the context of synthetic biology before about this kind of nebulous constructed public, right? And we're so in our minds, we've all constructed a kind of stakeholder, what that stakeholder looks like, and what kind of knowledge they have and what they might contribute. And I think we really need to pin that down. What do we mean by stakeholder? And I think, as Keith and Adam were saying, as we disentangle risk assessment into these different component parts, there will be different people who we want to engage. There may be people who have knowledge of an ecology, a particular region, who we might want to bring in. We might find other kinds of academic interdisciplinary knowledge, but then there may be stakeholders who know very much more about the problem that we're trying to solve, not about gene drive, but about conservation more broadly. So we need to think about the kind of knowledge that we want to bring in, and that will help us pin down what we mean by stakeholder.
So thank you. Thanks, Sarah. So this idea that a stakeholder can be an expert, maybe from a different discipline, or has knowledge of some aspect, for example, conservation, that is relevant for thinking about gene drive. So yeah, absolutely. So that sounds, and maybe that's a question again that other panelists may want to think about responding to. Yeah, who do we think of as a stakeholder? One of the questions I always have, especially in the gene drive discussions, is there seems to be obviously a lot of attention to stakeholders understood as sort of communities in the vicinity of proposed field trials, for example. But does it include, are we also thinking about stakeholders in a sort of broader way, which might then mean we think of people with certain kinds of expertise, certain kinds of knowledge that has not been seen to be relevant. They may not be part of the community, but may have something to offer. So maybe that's a question we can come back to. But Adam, I wanted to maybe ask you to pick up on a question that came up very early on from the floor, which was about, are there examples of risk assessment processes around gene drive that have specifically tried to incorporate stakeholder engagement or some aspect of stakeholder engagement? Can you maybe speak to that question, drawing on your experience of working in this in this area?
A couple things come to mind that are helpful for thinking about that. And one is, there's a way that we talk about risk assessment, and we assume it's the risk assessment that leads to a regulatory decision, right? So risk assessment is an important framework to inform governance decisions. But risk assessment is also something outside of the thing that is done to help inform a decision. Like, risk assessment is an academic field. You can do studies looking at certain components of the risk assessment process. So looking at certain problem formulation questions that doesn't have to inform or be related to a specific technology or a decision about a technology. Because we don't have any gene drives that are like at the regulatory decision phase, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't be doing engagement to inform risk assessments about gene drives, for example. So, in the gene drive context, then most of the engagement that would be being conducted is kind of about potential applications in the future where we don't actually know the specific attributes of the technology, but that you still can do engagement to inform future regulatory decisions, future risk assessments, to inform regulatory decisions, and to help kind of advance the risk assessment scholarship outside of specific regulatory decisions. we have an article that we're just finishing up where we did engagement with, we did a survey of 185 spotted wing Drosophila stakeholders. So people who have some sort of relationship to spotted wing Drosophila, and asked them about a potential gene drive and what would be the most important potential adverse effects and most important potential benefits of that technology, and asked them a host of qualitative and quantitative questions about that. You know, there's no gene drive for spotted wing Drosophila that is, you know, far along in the development stage, but yet we could ask stakeholders about this potential technology in more abstract terms. So I think for me, it's like, what's the right type of engagement given where these technologies are at, acknowledging that you can do engagement at a variety of different stages throughout the research and development process. And, you know, it is also important just to note that, you know, responsible innovation and these broader governance ideals about also have engagement as an important component of them. So risk assessment can kind of overlap with some of those efforts as well. Anyways, just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to jump in on that question? So experiences of risk assessment, maybe if not in the case of gene drive, I mean, Keith, for example, in other domains, do you have experience that you want to comment on of efforts to incorporate engagement into an existing risk assessment process around an emerging technology?
Yes, like I said, I think one of the good things that's come out of this whole debate around gene drives and risk assessment is, you know, the spotlight has gone back to stakeholder engagement. I think that's been really useful because it's certainly in my experience of doing risk assessments, you know, I don't think it's routinely done yet. I don't think we've got it, you know, I don't think the processes are in place or to make it, you know, routine and easy. So I think, you know, just re-examining that and through the lens of gene drive has been really useful. I mean, I think there are examples. I think there are good examples that, you know, I think the work that Tiger Malaria has been doing in Africa is something, you know, to be highlighted. I think there's been a, you know, from I'm not deeply embedded in that, but from my perspective, there seems to be, you know, a genuine and resourced attempt to engage stakeholders in the debate around the use of that technology there. And I think, you know, like I say, doing that in places like Burkina Faso and other places is, you know, is quite challenging. So I think that's one example I can think of in this context. The other examples I can think of, to be honest, then there's not lots of them. So I mean, again, it just speaks, I think, to some of the challenges, Sujatha, about, you know, why is it that why is it we're still, you know, having all acknowledged that it's a really important component, you know, and there's lots of places where it should occur. You know, why is it 50 years later from those first sort of discussions around that back in the 70s, as you pointed out, rightly, Sujatha, why is it we're still kind of struggling with, like, you know, okay, we should still be doing this better. And it's like, well, you know, so what were we doing the last 50 years? So yeah, it's I think there are some good examples, one or two good examples now. I think gene drive's been helping that. I still think there's, you know, there's obviously some improvements to make and some learnings to be made. So I'm still, yeah, I guess I'm still thinking about that as we go.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I also want to stress that the risk assessment, and I'm thinking about it from a governance perspective again, rather than the research perspective that Adam and Keith have been talking about to some degree. But you know, if we look at the case of the genetically modified mosquito in Burkina Faso, that risk assessment process, and in fact, if we look at the risk assessment process for genetically modified mosquitoes in Brazil, but also in the US, it is the decision that comes out of that risk assessment process which really determines whether the insect will be released or not. And if we look at those processes, we don't really see a lot of opportunity for engagement at the moment. There is and in fact, one of the questions in the chat raises this question around the consultation period as part of the risk assessment process. There is this sort of what I would call a nominal public consultation where the decision is made or semi-made and a document put out, and then there is a consultation on that document over a period of about 3 months, generally online, and then the regulator will reflect on that consultation and submit a document. But I guess my point is that risk assessment really matters in the process of technology development. If you think about it moving from the lab right through to its eventual commercialization or its use and deployment in the field, risk assessment is a critical juncture where publics want to get involved, where people want to get involved. And it is very likely that that risk assessment decision will determine whether the gene drive organism is released or not. So it puts immense pressure on that critical juncture if we think about the innovation process more broadly. And the remit with which most regulators work, and this is the same with US regulators as it is in European regulators, as it was in Brazil, as it was in Burkina Faso, the remit is science-based, so that there isn't often space for the regulator to be able to do that kind of engagement work. So what we've seen with target malaria in Africa is target malaria or other developers doing some of the risk assessment work necessary to prevent as they prepare the portfolio for the regulators to review. But the regulator itself is a different animal, if you like, and we do need to think about what's possible at that stage. Part of that reason, I think, is that we try to depoliticize risk, and regulations are seen to be these very scientific, apolitical spaces. But I think by not recognizing the political dimensions of technologies and forcing those political dimensions into this apolitical space, we risk politicizing the technology somewhere else.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to some of the questions in a moment, but before that, Adam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to, the issue of challenges has come up a couple of times, and I think it's really important in this conversation to grapple with some of these. So I have a few that come top of mind. One is that, Sarah was touching on it, right? That if you have a good risk assessment, that doesn't mean that the person making the decision is going to necessarily build on that risk assessment. So there's that like risk assessment and decision kind of distinction. It's also really hard to understand whether engagement in risk assessment is a good thing based on your perspective, because so much about the impact of risk assessment is based on how it's designed, who is involved, what questions are being opened up, or is it just a very narrow set of questions that are being opened up to engagement? And so there's so much within these design questions that leads one to, that influences how one would think about whether it's good. And based on your perspective, those can be different things, right? If you're happy with the status quo of risk assessments without engagement, why would you want to change that status quo? You might not. If you want more incremental improvements or substantive improvements to risk assessment because you're concerned about marginalized worldviews not being compatible with risk assessments, because you're concerned about issues of justice, of trust of the decision, of the substantive impact, or the quality of these decisions, then you might see engagement as a way towards those ends. But it's actually really hard to know in the abstract whether engagement is going to lead to either of those ends. It can be done in purely a window dressing way of, now we've done an inclusive engagement, but the answer is going to be the characterization of risk is going to be the same as to even if you didn't have engagement. Or it could actually be kind of more of a challenge to the status quo. And the bottom line is you don't know until you actually design a specific risk, design engagement and include particular people. So that detail is really important. And then you can have a great engagement that leads to a great characterization of risk, and then the decision maker, totally says that's not going to be the kind of factors that I consider in this decision. And so that's really a challenge for people trying to like promote engagement and risk assessment, is that what exactly you're promoting and you don't really know except for the context. You know, just a couple of other brief things. If it's hard to get funding for studying the environmental impacts of technology, as opposed to just the development of new technologies that people get excited about, then it's certainly hard to do engagement within risk assessment, because you're kind of 2 steps removed on difficult things to get funding for. And then I think also just, you know, thinking about, it's not just the risk assessment realm that has a hard time with this relationship between science and values, right? There's often this kind of slippery slope argument where if we acknowledge the role of values in risk assessment, or if we acknowledge the role of values in science, then we just end up in a relativist free-for-all. So instead of helping people understand the nuances and complexities of risk in science, we double down on trying to convince people of simplistic and inadequate ideals of value-free science and value-free risk assessment that people ultimately see through and don't trust. So, you know, those are some of, that leads, I mean, those are lots of really significant challenges facing engagement and risk assessment that I think explain why we've seen over the past 40 years, these calls, these recognitions, but then ultimately nothing being done. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Adam. And I think that really sets us up very nicely to move towards more questions from the Q&A from the floor. So I think what you've highlighted there kind of shows that, so we need to be thinking about risk assessment, you know, as Sarah and Keith have highlighted, and Sam, you've talked about as well. But actually we need to also think about how stakeholder engagement itself is organized and where that all fits in terms of the larger kind of governance decision-making kind of framework. So maybe there's a third element to our kind of topic for the day, which is about risk governance or decision-making that ultimately kind of determines what comes out of all this. So I think that point you made, Adam, links very nicely to one of the questions that actually was raised a while back from the floor, which was about what the scope is, especially in the American context, for outcomes or inputs from public engagement or stakeholder engagement to actually be taken up by the government. And the point there is that there are kind of statutory limitations. So it's not just maybe a matter of willingness, but also kind of limitations that are built into the framework to begin with. So does anybody want to kind of comment on that? What are the kind of, statutory limitations at that governance or decision-making level that might affect the ability to react to or respond to points from public or stakeholder engagement? Any takers?
So this is the point that I was making earlier about the remit of regulators. And so one study that I was involved with looked at the European Food Safety Authority's development of guidelines for risk assessment for genetically modified animals. And we looked at the public consultation process in that, in the development of those guidelines. And the consultation raised a host of issues which fell outside the statutory remit of EFSA. And the comments that the stakeholders have made or the public had made were not considered because they couldn't be considered. There was no space to consider them. Now, I mean, I think in practical terms, they could have been passed on to the European Commission, and it was the Commission, in fact, who has the responsibility to consider those non-scientific issues. But in practice, it's quite a messy process. It's not always clear. And I'd say probably in the US context, it's even more difficult. You know, we also looked at the process of the diamondback moth, the genetically modified diamondback moth, and USDA's consultation around that release. And it was even less clear at the USDA how the decision, how those public comments are then responded to. But I do think the statutory remit is a challenge.
And just to kind of say the obvious, like getting public comments on an already completed risk assessment is very different from the type of engagement that we've been discussing here, where you're doing engagement in an upstream way. And so, you know, there may be certain established norms and even statutory limitations, but those norms and statutory limitations can always change, right? And so I think as we're thinking about what's needed to develop these and do risk assessments in a good way, we want to be aware of these existing challenges, but not feel constrained by them, or overly constrained by them. Yes.
Yeah. So those limitations can be maybe addressed, yeah, in future. I want to pick up on this point about whether or not gene drive is exceptional in terms of the questions we've been asking today. So are there particular characteristics of gene drive that maybe demand stakeholder engagement to be connected to the process of risk assessment? Or is it something that, you know, what we've been talking about, is it something that, you know, applies equally to maybe most or all emerging technologies? So anybody wants to pick up on that point about the exceptionalism of gene drive or otherwise?
Sujatha, yeah, I think there's, I think, you know, that I'm glad that gene drive is you know, has facilitated and catalyzed this debate again. I think it's useful. But having said that, in the same breath, I think part of the early, I think certainly part of the early discussions, representation of gene drive were quite, you know, there was, there's hype's probably the wrong word, but there, you know, there's a lot of talk of, you know, release a single organism and it will spread across the entire planet type. You know, it was conceptualized in a way which the very early conceptions of it were quite dramatic, I think, and you know, I think that's been part of the reason why the spotlight sort of re-emerged around sort of stakeholder engagement in that, and who's going to be impacted, and geez, we could, you know, one could escape from a lab and, you know, an entire continent would be impacted. Now, you know, I think that discussion of technology has matured somewhat, and I think people, you know, appreciate that it's you know, it's probably not quite that clear cut, which is true. So I think the exceptionalism, there are, you know, in theory, there are definitely some, you know, some particular aspects of the technology, you know, irreversible, very low thresholds, you know, potentially very large impacts from a, you know, from a small intervention, if you like. So there are, you know, there are some, the aspects of it were highlighted, I think, perhaps too much in the early discussion. I think that was part of the rationale for some of this thing, for some of this for larger debate. Now, you know, as I said, I think the larger debate has been really useful. But I think some of the ways the way that was initially catalyzed is, you know, is probably, you know, was probably overemphasizing some aspects of the technology now, which I think people have, you know, recognized that, you know, it's not quite going to be that simple. So I think that would be my take on it.
Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, well, I'll just comment on this to say that that this kind of question gets us to perhaps a much deeper level of engagement conversation, because it opens up the question of, well, what is a gene drive? And our definition of a gene drive relates to the context in which that definition needs to be understood. So I have a paper in the Journal of Responsible Innovation with Megan Palmer, where we talk about gene drives as political and regulatory anomalies. And we go through a series of examples of showing how the definition of a gene drive changes depending on both the context, you know, so where you're having a discussion about what we need to do about the gene drive, but also the governance framework within which you can have that kind of conversation. So a risk assessment conversation will be different than a stakeholder engagement conversation and the like. And so, you know, the gene drive, the NASEM report, you know, said that gene drives are an anomaly because of their intentional spread and potential irreversibility. Like those were the two characteristics that came up again and again in that report to separate it off. And our paper was making the point that that characterization of gene drives as an anomaly serves a political and social purpose to open up the conversation, to have this conversation, for instance, that we're having now, about ways of thinking differently about, in this case, risk assessment and stakeholder engagement. So I would caution us to come down on any one side here on what a gene drive is, and instead turn that into a conversation of do we think that the ways that we govern emerging technologies need to change, and can gene drives be a space where we can experiment with doing that kind of governance differently? And I think that I think I can speak for the panel in saying that we do think that this is an opportunity to think differently about how we govern emerging technology, and that in itself is a value that we should be considering.
So in a sense, that exceptionalism maybe is embedded in some of the ways in which regulators have been thinking about the technology, but also in this kind of more experimental possibilities that you've been highlighting. Yeah, very interesting. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions from the floor, and yeah, people can respond to one or the other or both. So one is a question about, is there a danger of doing engagement too early? So Adam, I think you mentioned upstream engagement. Various people, I mean, all the panelists have talked at various points about engaging at different stages in the risk assessment process. But yeah, if you can reflect on this point about is there a risk of doing engagement too early? And another question, which maybe is related to that, which is about, is the engagement about, is it about perceived risks or the real risk? That's another way in which, yeah, people might think about this, real versus perceived risks. So yeah, feel free to address either or both of those questions.
So I can just go first. And, you know, there's the question about perceived or real risks. And then I also saw somebody raise the question of how does this relate to risk communication? And I think, you know, it's really, in terms of how I'm thinking about this, and I think those of us on the panel, it's important to be clear that, you know, there needs to be engagement to inform risk communication. There needs to be engagement to inform risk management. There needs to be engagement for broader governance, decision-making, responsible innovation, and so forth. But what we're talking about here is engagement in risk assessment per se, which is different than doing risk communication work. It's different than doing risk perception work. We're talking about the value judgments within risk assessment that influence how it is that we come to study and understand what the real risks are. So we're saying the real risks have within them these judgments that are important to reflect upon with a broad set of folks, stakeholders. Yeah, that's my thought on that.
Adam, do you want to give an example of, I think you did give one earlier, but do you want to give an example of some of these values that might be actually embedded in risk assessment? I think earlier you were talking about, you know, judgments like, is it an inconsequential risk or is it significant? You know, there's a value judgment there, but yeah, I don't know if do you want to elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, and then, I mean, Keith has done lots of risk assessments. I'm sure he could also speak to this in his sleep a bit. So, you know, in addition to what are the goals, how do we define harm, there's like, what are the most important potential adverse effects and risk hypotheses that we want to make sure we look at. You can't study every potential impact of a potential technology because that would be almost infinite, right? So you have to prioritize. And that prioritization process certainly has a values-laden, is a values-laden worldview-based kind of judgment. What studies are needed to result in a trusted and rigorous and relevant characterization of risk, right? That judgment. How do you design studies, interpret data, make extrapolations, decide upon assumptions in a model? I mean, how do you weigh conflicting findings? All of these types of like decisions that are integral to the risk assessment process, have worldviews laden or would be answered differently based on one's worldview. And therefore, it's useful to have a whole host of people who hold different worldviews reflect on what's at stake in the different ways of making these particular judgments. Not to try and get rid of these judgments, but just to try and see them clearly and understand what's at stake in the different potential ways of making them.
Yeah. Keith, do you want to give an example or two of, the value judgments in risk assessment?
We absolutely have. Adam's got given quite a long list there. I think so. Maybe one which we can pick back up on this perceived versus real risks. With any, I would argue, with any new technology which we have no operating experience with, which we haven't lived with for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Any novel technology, all the risks are by definition perceived. Right, and that perception is based on a conceptual model of, somebody will, no risk assessment, quantitative or qualitative, emerges from a vacuum. It emerges from a mind. If you have an opinion, when you express an opinion on risk, that opinion is expressed based on a conceptual model of how you think the world works, how you think that new technology is going to work, how you think those two things will interact, whether what you think will be threatened by it. The likelihood and consequences, that's all bundled up in your mind when you express, a judgment, be it qualitative or in the process of eliciting that to make it quantitative. So one example of value judgments which become important, or where values are, need to be sort of illuminated is in that conceptual model. Because I think that underlies all our perceptions, and for a novel technology, all risk assessments are based on those perceptions, because we don't have accident statistics to look back on and say, okay, well, we've had 20 operating years of this, there's been 20,000 exposures, or there's been 30,000 hours of activity, and we've seen this many accidents and this many injuries. We don't have that operating basis to go back on and say they're the real risks, because that was the real world experiment that occurred, and that was the data. So I think one really good example there, and I think something which we've advocated in the past is to ask stakeholders, how do you think the world works? Like, what is it? What do you think the important interactions are? For example, in the ecosystem, who interacts with who? Why would this new technology? How would this new technology, change those interactions? So I think that's a good example of where people's values and their beliefs and understandings, can contribute to the process of risk assessment and can make it a better process by virtue of that.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one more question and then leave some time for final reflections. So the question was to do with responsibility for doing engagement. So I think the question is framed partly in terms of who is doing the stakeholder engagement. Is it scientists or regulators and so forth, developers? But maybe that's also a question about who should have responsibility for doing engagement. Anybody wants to pick up on that before we do a final wrap up?
Well, I can just briefly say that, like we were opening up this question of what constitutes a stakeholder, I think we've also been working to open up this question of what constitutes engagement. And I think several of us have pointed out the value of engaging, of different forms of engagement at different stages of the risk assessment and research life cycle. And so I think the responsibility for that that's a great question, because it opens up this, the question of not who who should be necessarily doing the engagement, but who also needs to ensure that such engagement happens. I think those are two different questions, because the groups that should be involved, we can talk about till the cows come home, but the groups that need to ensure that those people's voices are heard and responded to are those that currently have the power, that currently pull the levers on understanding or that have the power within the current decision frameworks. And I think what we're arguing here is that those decision frameworks need to be tweaked, need to be inspected, need to be held to account. But the power for doing so still rests disproportionately within those who currently run those processes.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. So just moving towards then the final reflections. So I'm going to ask each of you to maybe take no more than a minute to highlight maybe what's the one key maybe responsibility or key implication that you think has come out of either from the discussion or other work on how this whole process can actually be improved. So we've been talking, as Sam said, opened up the notions of engagement, of risk assessment, of who's a stakeholder and so forth. So what needs to be done next? Yeah, so a minute maybe before I turn it back to Karen. Who wants to start? Sarah?
I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I also just want to quickly reflect on Sam's last point about who's responsible. And I think, so we know that regulators do not do risk assessments. They are responsible for reviewing the risk assessment conducted by others. And we do know that the developers have a responsibility to do risk assessment as part of the portfolio application for a release. And we also know that as we're sort of muddling through this development, before a first application is made for Gene Drive, we're kind of muddling through this, and there's lots of input from different groups. And there are some social scientists working on engagement and risk assessment, and there are other developers who are doing the same. So at the moment, there's a lot of information coming in, and I think there's, as Sam said, it would be good to sort of pin that down a little bit more and have a discussion about who's responsible. So I think that's a good point. In terms of my reflection, I think there's still kind of a reluctance, if you like, to really recognize the value judgments in risk assessment. I think there's also still a reluctance to acknowledge the role that risk assessment plays in the overall decision about whether to release a gene drive organism or not. And I think if we recognize the importance of that, we would, I think, it would justify the need to open up risk assessment more. And I'm not talking perhaps about the sort of quantitative risk assessment that Keith is talking about, but seeing perhaps risk assessment in a more holistic way, and not seeing that separation between the scientific risk assessment and the democratic decision about whether to release or not a gene drive, because I don't think that decision will happen anywhere. I'm not under any fallacy that we're going to have some democratic debate about whether or not to release a gene drive. It will sort of happen through the risk assessment process. So I think some recognition of the importance of risk assessment is also needs to be combined with the importance of or the challenges of doing stakeholder engagement and risk assessment. We know that stakeholder engagement, even in policy discussions, is hugely challenging, but it's even more challenging in a space where experts dominate. And this comes back to Sam's point about power. And we can't look at opening up risk assessment without thinking about power.
Thank you, Sarah. Keith, your final thoughts? 40 seconds.
Final thoughts in 40 seconds. I think if we get to a situation whereby the first time stakeholders are engaged in the process is when we present them the results of risk assessment and ask for comments. if we get to that, nothing would have failed. So, from my perspective, anything more than that is a good step in the right direction. So, I mean, I'm heartened to see more discussion and more recognition of the importance of having them upstream.
Thank you. Perfect. Sam, do you want to offer your final thoughts?
Sure. Well, I mean, coming back to my point at the beginning, I think that we need to ensure that we need to remember the deep-seated nature of the assumptions of the separation of science and and values that we're trying to push against here. And to understand how to push against that, I think that it is very useful for us to consider gene drive regulations and governance and the connections between risk assessment and stakeholder engagement as a site of experimentation itself. So there's the research that's going on the scientific side, but understanding the process of doing that research and its the movement through regulatory and community spaces is also a site of experimentation. And so appreciating that much more, I think, is essential for this for the kinds of discussions we're having to translate into actual movement.
Fabulous. And Adam, last word to you.
Yeah, so I want to harken back to something Sarah touched on earlier. Lots of these conversations are about future risk assessments, about future gene drive products. But one thing that is taking place right now that's going to influence what form all future risk assessment takes is the kind of establishment of formal and informal risk assessment guidelines. So these kind of cookbook formulas that people use to actually assess the risks. And there's conversations going on right now about what form those should take. And that's another important site for engagement, because what form you think risk assessment should take is also dependent upon your worldview, of course. So how applicable are existing risk assessment guidelines or paradigms? What should be the key steps for gene drive risk assessment? And even what should be the role of engagement for risk assessment on specific gene drive applications going forward? If we don't incorporate engagement into these risk assessment guidelines, taking place now, that's going to severely limit, decision making and risk assessments into the future.
Thank you. Fabulous. Yeah, that was a fantastic discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Karen and Royden, sorry, for final wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujatha, Sarah, Keith, and Sam, for sharing your experiences and knowledge, for providing a thought-provoking deep dive discussion today. And thank you to all the other participants for joining the call and asking the hard questions. The next session in this series will be held on April 13th and will focus on integrating social criteria into field testing site selection and linking those two. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Katie Barnhill-Dilling of North Carolina State University. We look forward to another inspiring discussion and hope that you will join us. Enjoy the rest of your day or night, as the case has it. Thank you.